Hello, my friend. I'm glad you're back. Whatever the day handed you, however full it was, however loud, however relentless the hours between waking and this moment, you can set it down now. All of it. Right here, at the threshold of this room. You won't need any of it for the next little while. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands rest wherever they naturally fall. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nothing you need to remember. Nothing you need to decide. Nothing you need to be, except present. Just relax, right here, in this quiet place. In a moment, I'm going to take you somewhere. Not far and not fast. We move slowly here, in this archive. We have learned over a long time of sitting with ancient things that the most extraordinary stories reveal themselves not to those who rush toward them, but to those who are willing to simply be still and listen. Tonight's story is 3,000 years old. It belongs to a civilization that understood, better than almost any other, that the things worth knowing cannot be hurried, that the desert gives up its secrets only to patience, that the most important things are often the quietest. So breathe. Let the warmth of the room settle around you like something familiar. Let the sound of rain, or silence, or whatever the night outside is offering, become simply the backdrop to something older, and stranger, and more beautiful than the ordinary day you are leaving behind. You are safe here. You are welcome here. The archive is open, and a beautiful one is just about to arrive. I would like to start with her name. Let us begin there, because her name is where everything begins, and where, if you look at it carefully enough, the first question appears almost immediately. Nefertiti. In the ancient Egyptian language, as best as scholars have been able to reconstruct it across the considerable distance of 3,500 years, the name translates with a directness that is either perfectly simple or quietly extraordinary depending on how much attention you choose to give it. Her name literally translates to, "The beautiful one has come." Not the beautiful one was born. Not the beautiful one was made or blessed or given, or any of the other constructions that Egyptian naming conventions routinely employed to locate a child within the existing order of things. Within a family, a lineage, a divine patronage, a geographical origin. None of the above. It actually says, in the literal translation, has come. An arrival? A movement from somewhere else toward here, a trajectory with an implied point of origin that the name conspicuously declines to specify. In a civilization that was extraordinarily meticulous about origins, that tracked lineage and title and divine ancestry through the most elaborate bureaucratic and religious record-keeping systems in the ancient world, a name that describes an arrival without specifying a departure point is not nothing. It is, in the particular language of Egyptian historical silence, a question dressed as a statement. If the name means, "The beautiful one has come," then the inevitable question is from where? The honest answer, and this archive has always preferred honesty to narrative convenience, even when honesty is considerably less satisfying, is that we do not know. We do not know where Nefertiti came from. We do not know who her parents were. We do not know whether she was born in Egypt or arrived in Egypt from somewhere else. whether her first language was the Egyptian that flows through every inscription bearing her name, or some other tongue that she learned later, with the particular facility of someone who understood that language is a form of power. We do not know with any certainty anything about the first 15 or perhaps 20 years of her life. The historical record simply does not contain her. And then suddenly, completely, with the totality of a figure stepping from the wings into full stage light, she is everywhere. Imagine for a moment the texture of that silence, not the dramatic silence of a sealed tomb or a deliberate erasure. We will come to those later, because Nefertiti's story contains more than its share of deliberate silences, but the ordinary silence of records that were never made, of a life that was not yet considered worth documenting. Every great figure in history has this zone of undocumented time before their significance became apparent. The years before the story began, when they were simply a person moving through a world that had not yet arranged itself around them. For Nefertiti, that zone is larger than most, and the theories that have rushed in to fill it tell us as much about the scholars who proposed them and the eras in which they worked as they do about the woman herself. The dominant theory, the one that has accumulated the most scholarly support over the past several decades, though support in Egyptology is always a provisional and contested thing, proposes that Nefertiti was Egyptian. Specifically, that she was the daughter, or possibly the niece, of a man named I is one of the more fascinating supporting figures in the drama of the Amarna period. A man of sufficient political dexterity to serve in high office under Akhenaten, survive the collapse of the Amarna experiment, guide the boy king Tutankhamun through his brief reign, and eventually claim the throne himself in the chaotic years following Tutankhamun's death. A survivor of the most comprehensive kind. If Nefertiti was his daughter, and the evidence is suggestive rather than definitive, built on title and inference rather than explicit statement, then she would have been raised in the Egyptian court, educated in its traditions, formed by its particular combination of religious devotion and political sophistication. She would have arrived at Akhenaten's side already fluent in the languages of power. The alternative theory is more romantic in the popular sense of the word, and correspondingly more difficult to establish, with the kind of evidence that survives 3,500 years of desert preservation. It proposes that Nefertiti was not Egyptian at all, that she was a princess of the Mitanni, the powerful Hurrian kingdom of northern Mesopotamia, whose territory in the mid-14th century BCE stretched across what is now Syria and northern Iraq, and whose relationship with Egypt was managed through a sophisticated diplomatic system that included, as one of its primary instruments, the exchange of royal women. The Mitanni sent daughters to Egypt, and Egypt, in the person of the pharaoh, received them as great royal wives or lesser wives, incorporating them into the royal household and the diplomatic architecture simultaneously. Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, had received Mitanni princesses in exactly this way. The letters survive, in fact, in that extraordinary archive of diplomatic correspondence discovered near Amarna in 1887, the clay tablets that began to crack open the Amarna period for modern scholarship. In those letters, the kings of the Mitanni write to the pharaoh with a mixture of flattery, strategic calculation, and occasional exasperation that feels remarkably contemporary across the 3.5 millennia that separate their composition from this lamp-lit desk. If Nefertiti arrived from the Mitanni, sent south, along the diplomatic highway that connected the great powers of the ancient Near East, traveling with a retinue appropriate to her status, entering Egypt, speaking a language that was not Egyptian, and carrying in her bearing and her education the marks of a different court, a different tradition, a different understanding of what power looked and felt like. Then her name, "The Beautiful One Has Come," is not merely a name, it is a description of a literal event, an arrival from outside, from somewhere the record declines to specify. We cannot resolve this question tonight. The evidence does not permit a definitive conclusion, and the historical record does not manufacture certainty where it offers only suggestion. What we can say with confidence is that Nefertiti appears in the historical record at the beginning of Akhenaten's reign, a reign that began around 1353 BCE. From the moment of her appearance, the scale and nature of her presence in the official record are unprecedented. The role of the great royal wife in traditional Egyptian court life was significant, but clearly defined. She was the king's chief consort, the mother of his heirs, and the primary female presence in the ritual and ceremonial life of the court. Her status was high, considerably higher than that of lesser wives and concubines, and she carried titles and privileges that marked her as a figure of real consequence. But she was not in the traditional framework of Egyptian royal iconography, a ruler. She did not make offerings to the gods in the manner of a king. She did not perform the ritual acts believed to sustain cosmic order, acts reserved specifically for the pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, and the divine intermediary between the human and the sacred. She did not strike the enemies of Egypt. Nefertiti, however, is depicted doing all of these things. From the earliest years of Akhenaten's reign, before the move to Amarna, before the full theological revolution had announced itself in all its extraordinary destabilizing completeness, Nefertiti appears in the official imagery performing actions that had no female precedent in the Egyptian artistic record. She stands before the Aten, that solar disk whose importance was beginning, even in these early years, to overshadow the rest of the pantheon, in the posture of a priest making offerings. Her arms are raised, her hands open, her body aligned with the ritual geometry that signals divine approved authority rather than mere devotional attendance. She does not stand beside the king as the queen stands beside the king. She stands with the king as an equal participant in the ritual act, as though the distinction between their roles, the distinction that 15 centuries of Egyptian theological tradition had carved as deep as hieroglyphs into stone, has been deliberately, carefully, systematically dissolved. And then there is the image that stops every scholar who encounters it for the first time, the image of Nefertiti striking the enemies. The smiting scene, the pharaoh raising a weapon over a cluster of defeated, kneeling enemies, the embodiment of Egypt's dominion over chaos and disorder, is one of the oldest and most consistently reproduced motifs in Egyptian royal iconography. It appears on the Narmer palette, one of the earliest monuments of Egyptian kingship, dating to approximately 3100 BCE. It appears on the walls of temples across Egypt, reproduced with the ritual consistency of an image that is not merely decorative, but functionally necessary. A statement renewed in stone, again and again, of the divine order that the pharaoh alone has the authority and the cosmic mandate to enforce. It is, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a royal prerogative. And at the temple site of Karnak, in carved relief blocks that were later dismantled and used as fill in later construction, discovered by archaeologists, and painstakingly reassembled into the extraordinary visual archive known as the Karnak-Talatat. There is an image of Nefertiti raising her arm over kneeling enemies in the posture of the Pharaoh, performing the smiting act with the authority of the divine mandate. Pause with me here for a moment, because I want you to feel the full weight of what that image represents. Not merely the political significance, though the political significance is considerable, but the theological weight of it. In a civilization where the relationship between image and reality was considerably more intimate than our own understanding of representation allows, where the carved image was not a depiction of an act, but in some meaningful sense, the act itself, preserved and perpetuated in stone. An image of Nefertiti performing the smiting act is not simply a flattering portrait of a powerful queen. It is a statement, carved in stone, sanctioned by the court, placed in a temple, that Nefertiti possessed the divine authority of kingship. Or at minimum, that someone, the king, the court, the theological architects of the early Amarna revolution wished to assert that she did. She was beautiful. This seems almost beside the point, given everything else we have established about her. The power, the unprecedented iconographic status, the theological authority that the Amarna reliefs claim for her so explicitly and so repeatedly, and yet it is where the popular imagination has always begun, and it would be dishonest to pretend that the physical evidence does not support the tradition. The art of the early 18th dynasty, before the Amarna revolution, transformed the aesthetic vocabulary of Egyptian visual culture into something altogether stranger and more intimate, depicted its subjects in the idealized formal manner that had characterized Egyptian royal portraiture for centuries. The figures are serene, perfectly proportioned according to a canon that prioritized legibility and eternal dignity over individual likeness. The faces are smooth, the expressions composed, the overall impression one of a beauty so formalized that it approaches abstraction. Within this convention, Nefertiti is rendered with a consistency and a particularity that suggests the artists of the early court were working from something more specific than the general template of queenly beauty. The long neck, the high cheekbones, the perfectly balanced proportion of brow and jaw, the eyes rendered with a precision that the traditional canon did not require, but that appears again and again in the images of this specific face. These are not generic markers of royal femininity. They are a face, a specific individual, particular face, rendered with a care that suggests the people making these images were looking at something, someone, rather than merely reproducing a convention. But beauty, in the context of Nefertiti's story, is the least interesting thing about her. It is where the story begins, perhaps, in a name that speaks of arrival, and a face that demanded to be rendered with unusual particularity. But it is not where the story lives. The story lives in the power. The year is approximately 1346 BCE, 7 years into Akhenaten's reign. The old gods of Thebes, Amun and his vast institutional infrastructure, the priests and the temples, and the accumulated theological authority of 15 centuries, have been dealt a series of increasingly decisive blows. The Aten has been elevated, the royal court has been moved, and somewhere in the planning, in the theological architecture of what is about to happen, in the decisions being made about what kind of city to build, and what kind of god to worship in it, and what kind of ruler is needed to stand between the divine solar disk and the people it illuminates, Nefertiti is present. Her hand is in it. How deeply, in what capacity, With what precise authority? These are questions the next section of this archive will attempt to examine. But standing here, at the threshold of the moment when the royal couple turns their backs on Thebes and its ancient gods and its carved and painted certainties, and sets their faces toward the open desert and the blank ground where a new world is about to be built from nothing. Nefertiti is not standing behind Akhenaten, she is actually standing beside him, facing the same sun. To understand what Nefertiti and Akhenaten built in the desert, you must first understand what they left behind. Thebes in the 14th century before the Common Era was not merely a city. It was an argument made in stone and gold and the accumulated theological authority of centuries, an argument so thoroughly constructed, so deeply embedded in the physical landscape and the social fabric and the daily ritual life of everyone who lived within its reach, that it had long since ceased to feel like an argument at all. It felt like reality. The temples of Karnak, that extraordinary still expanding complex on the east bank of the Nile, its hypostyle hall of towering columns already centuries old by the time Akhenaten came to the throne, were not merely buildings. They were a cosmological statement in limestone and sandstone and gold. The enclosed sanctuaries, the progressive narrowing of the processional route from the outer courts toward the innermost chamber, where the divine statue resided in absolute lamp-lit darkness. This architecture was not accidental, it was theological. It said, in the language of stone and shadow, that the sacred is found in concealment, that the divine requires an intermediary, a priesthood trained in the protocols of approach, a graduated system of access in which the uninitiated could come only so far and no further. It said that God lives in the dark. Akhenaten looked at this argument and made a different one. The open-air temples of the Aten were not merely a different architectural style. They were a philosophical counterproposition. If the traditional temples said that the sacred is hidden, then the Aten temple said that the sacred is visible, present in the light that falls on every surface without discrimination, available to every eye that is willing to look upward, requiring no priestly intermediary, no graduated approach, no inner sanctum of carefully managed darkness, no roof. This is what strikes modern visitors to the Amarna site even now, the absence of ceilings in the great temples of the Aten, the open sky where the stone vault should be, the sun falling directly onto the offering tables and the altars, and the painted reliefs of the royal family making their devotions. In a country where temples had been roofed chambers of controlled and meaningful darkness for 15 centuries, an open-air temple was not merely an architectural innovation, it was a revolution. But before the new city could rise, the old world had to be addressed. And here is where the Amarna period enters territory that the curator finds genuinely, persistently disturbing. Not in the theatrical sense, not as a performance of unease, but in the quiet, considered sense of something that deserves to be called by its right name. What Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and at this point in the story, the evidence suggests we should name them together as co-architects of what was happening rather than actor and witness, ordered across Egypt in these years, was not merely religious reform. It was a systematic campaign of metaphysical murder. The name of Amun was chiseled from temple walls, not only in Thebes, not only in the major cult centers where the political logic of marginalizing the Amun priesthood might be obvious, but across Egypt, in private tomb inscriptions, in the dedications of minor officials, in the names of individuals who had been born with Amun as part of their own personal nomenclature and who now existed in a state of theological illegality, simply by virtue of carrying their own names. Consider what that means. To send work gangs. And this required work gangs. Organized labor directed from the center, operating under royal authority across the entire geographical span of Egypt, to chisel a name from every surface where it appeared. Not because the name was aesthetically displeasing, not because the inscription was structurally problematic, but because the name itself had been declared by royal and theological decree to represent something that no longer existed. In Egyptian theological understanding, to destroy the name was to destroy the entity that bore it. The gods of the traditional pantheon were not being demoted, they were being unmade. Their names removed from the surfaces that had sustained them, their cult statues abandoned, their rituals suspended, their temples closed, and their estates redirected toward the administration of the new cult. Amun, Mut, Khonsu, the entire hierarchy of the Egyptian divine order, assembled and refined over 15 centuries of theological development, being killed, systematically, inscription by inscription, wall by wall, in a campaign whose geographical reach speaks of absolute royal authority, exercised without hesitation or restraint. Nefertiti's hands were in this. The evidence does not permit us to distribute the decision-making of the Amarna period with any precision. We cannot say with certainty what Akhenaten determined and what Nefertiti shaped, or what the theological advisors around them contributed to the overall architecture of the revolution. But the imagery tells us that she was not peripheral. She is present in the early Amarna reliefs, participating in the ritual acts of the new cult with the same authority and the same regularity as the king himself. She is part of the decision. Whatever the decision was and wherever it came from, she is represented as its co-embodiment. And that representation, carved in stone and repeated across the surfaces of the new city, was itself a form of policy. The city of Akhenaten rose from the desert floor with a speed that still impresses scholars who study the archaeology of its construction. On a site on the east bank of the Nile, chosen, Akhenaten's boundary stelae tell us, because it belonged to no previous god, no previous temple, no previous claim. A city was built from nothing in approximately 3 years. Imagine that. Not the gradual accretion of a city that grows over generations, accumulating its neighborhoods and its infrastructure and its character in the slow, organic way that most cities accumulate theirs. But a planned city, imposed on open ground, constructed by the labor of tens of thousands of workers, operating under the directing intelligence of royal architects who had been given both the resources of the most powerful state in the world and a deadline that admitted no argument. The central city was laid out along a royal road running north to south, broad enough for the king's chariot procession, flanked by the administrative buildings and the great temple complexes of the Aten, with the royal palace positioned to command the road and the river simultaneously. The great temple of the Aten stretched for nearly a kilometer from its entrance to its innermost sanctuary, open to the sky for its entire length. Offering tables arranged in their thousands along the central axis, each one capable of receiving the gifts that the royal family would bring in daily procession from the palace. Gifts made not in the darkness of a traditional sanctuary, but in the full, unmediated, overwhelming presence of the God whose worship required nothing between the worshipper and the light. And everywhere, on the walls of the temples and the palaces and the private houses of the officials who had followed the court from Thebes, some willingly, some perhaps less so, all of them now inhabitants of a city that did not exist a decade before they arrived in it, the imagery of the royal family. Not the formal hieratic imagery of traditional Egyptian royal art, something new. something that sits, even after 3,500 years of scholarly examination, somewhat outside the categories we use to organize our understanding of ancient visual culture. The art of Amarna is one of the most discussed and least resolved phenomena in Egyptology, and Nefertiti is at its center. In the traditional royal imagery of the 18th dynasty, the imagery that the early years of Akhenaten's reign had still produced, before the revolution fully declared itself, Nefertiti appeared as the idealized great royal wife. Beautiful in the formalized, serene manner of Egyptian royal portraiture, her figure conforming to the canonical proportions, her face carrying the composed, eternal expression of someone who has been rendered not as they looked on a particular morning, but as they were understood to be in some essential, permanent sense. Then Amarna happened, and the images changed. The figures in Amarna art are elongated, the skulls are extended at the rear, the limbs are attenuated, the torsos long, the hips unusually full for figures that are representing, among other things, the king and queen who stand between humanity and the divine. This is the Amarna style, and it applies to Nefertiti as completely as it applies to Akhenaten, as completely as it applies to the daughters who populate the Amarna reliefs with an intimacy that has no precedent in the official art of any previous Egyptian reign. The daughters, 6 of them, Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankhesenpaten, Nefer-Nefer-Uaten Tasheret, Nefer-Nefer-Ur, and Setipenre, their names a litany of Aten devotion, each one a theological statement in itself. In the Amarna reliefs, these children are everywhere. They sit on their parents' laps. They are raised toward the rays of the Aten that extend their small, open-handed fingers toward the royal family in the distinctive iconographic gesture of the new cult. They are kissed. They are held. They reach upward toward their mother's face with the unself-conscious physical confidence of children who know they are loved and have no reason to perform otherwise. This is extraordinary. Let me be precise about how extraordinary this is. Egyptian royal art in 3,000 years of production does not do this. The children of pharaohs appear in the official record as heirs, as theological symbols, as small formal figures ranked by importance and rendered in the canonical style that maintains their dignity and their status. They do not squirm. They do not reach upward with grasping infant hands. They are not shown in the process of being kissed by their mothers in scenes of such physical warmth that the modern viewer, separated from their making by 35 centuries, feels something uncomfortably close to recognition. Nefertiti, in the Amarna art, is shown doing all of these things, seated in the informal posture of a mother rather than the ceremonial posture of a queen. Her daughters arranged around her with the organized chaos of actual children rather than the formal ranks of dynastic succession. Her face, even in the elongated, otherworldly vocabulary of the Amarna style, carrying something that the traditional canon was not designed to capture, and that the Amarna artists pursued with what appears to be genuine intentionality, something that looks like feeling. And yet, and this is the paradox that sits at the heart of the Amarna visual record, the paradox that makes Nefertiti simultaneously the most human and the most remote figure in Egyptian royal history. The same woman shown kissing her daughters in scenes of domestic warmth is also shown, in the same period, the same city, the same artistic program, standing in the window of appearances above the cheering crowds of Akhenaten, her arms extended over the loyal officials assembled below, scattering gold collars and gifts, with the authority of a ruler dispensing divine favor to her subjects. Standing in the open-air temples of the Aten, with her arms raised in the offering posture, her body aligned with the ritual geometry of kingship, the solar disk sending its small-handed rays toward her, exactly as it sent them toward Akhenaten, co-officiating, co-ruling, co-standing between the people of Egypt and the god that gave them light. In the theology of the Aten cult as it developed at Amarna, the divine structure was a triad, the Aten at its apex, the solar disk, the source, the singular divine principle that Akhenaten's revolution had placed above all others and eventually in place of all others. Akhenaten as the divine sun, the living Pharaoh, the Aten's earthly embodiment, the channel through which the god's will and blessing flowed into the human world, and Nefertiti, not as the king's consort, not as the mother of the heirs, not in any of the supporting roles that Egyptian tradition had constructed for the great royal wife, but as the feminine principle of creation, the other half of the divine equation, without whom the channel between the Aten and humanity was incomplete. She was not merely a queen in this theology. She was, within the logic of the Aten cult, a deity, deified in her own lifetime, worshipped in her own right in the smaller temple at Amarna, known as the Mansion of the Benben, where her cult was celebrated with a ritual specificity that the evidence suggests was understood as genuinely, rather than merely formally, divine. The sun at Amarna set behind the western cliffs, in a display that the city's position, in that natural bay of open ground between the cliffs and the river, was perfectly arranged to observe. The light would gold everything first. The temple columns, the palace walls, the thousands of offering tables arranged along the great temple's central axis. A city that was built to receive the sun would, each evening, give it back in stages, the warmth withdrawing from the highest surfaces first and descending toward the ground as the cliffs threw their long shadow eastward across the city. Imagine standing in that shadow, watching the last of the light leave the upper registers of the temple pylons, feeling the temperature drop with a speed that the desert permits, that immediate clarifying cool that follows the sun's departure in a landscape with no humidity to hold the warmth in the air. At its height, in the years around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, when the city was complete and the population was at its maximum, and the great foreign tribute ceremony had drawn diplomatic missions from across the known world to pay court to the new power at the center of the Egyptian state. Amarna must have felt like it would last forever, like all utopias feel from the inside, when the idea is still new enough to hold its shape. But the desert, which preserves so much, also teaches a particular lesson to anyone patient enough to learn it. Sand shifts. What is built on sand shifts with it. And in the shadows at the edge of the Golden City, in the worker cemeteries that archaeologists have excavated in recent years, in a royal tomb cut into the eastern cliffs, where the evidence of sudden, repeated, devastating loss is written in the burial record, something was already moving, not metaphysically, not as divine punishment for the theological revolution, whatever the restored priests of Amun may later have claimed, but biologically, epidemiologically, with the cold, indifferent efficiency of a pathogen moving through a population that has no defenses against it, and no understanding of its mechanism, and no resources of medicine adequate to its scale. The records are fragmentary, and their meaning is still debated, but the evidence from the Amarna period, the burial patterns, the skeletal remains from the workers' cemetery, and the diplomatic letters from year 12 onward, tells a troubling story. These letters begin to mention illness with growing frequency, their tone edged with barely contained alarm. Together, they suggest that this golden city, at the height of its brilliance, was already in the early grip of something that would soon change everything. The daughters were among the first to be taken. The sun sets over the desert. Inside the royal palace, rooms are adorned with painted marsh scenes, kingfishers skimming across blue-green reeds, alive with the innocent vitality of a world that still seems whole. But the most powerful woman in the ancient world is beginning to understand. This utopia has a shadow, and that shadow is growing longer. Now, let's get into the great vanishing. If we could give it a title to this section, I would call it The Disappearance and the Identity Theft Theory. The year is approximately 1341 BCE, in year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, and from the perspective of the diplomatic delegations arriving for the great tribute ceremony, Amarna rises from the desert as something almost unreal, a city that briefly presents itself as the center of the known world, shimmering with authority, theology, and ambition. The tribute ceremony of year 12 draws delegations from vast and distant regions, including Nubia, the Levantine city-states, the great powers of Mesopotamia, and the Aegean, and other lands whose exact identities are still debated by scholars, and they arrive not only with tribute, but with political awareness that this new capital, however radical its religious vision, represents a concentration of power that demands recognition, a reality preserved in the detailed reliefs carved into the tombs of Amarna officials, where the procession of foreign envoys is recorded with striking precision. Yet beneath this display of order and devotion, something else moves through the city, something unrecorded in official inscriptions and absent from ceremonial reliefs, a biological force spreading quietly through a densely populated urban landscape, where workers, officials, and courtiers live in close proximity within a rapidly constructed capital that has not yet developed the resilience or infrastructure needed to resist disease. Evidence for this disruption emerges from multiple sources that converge without ever fully naming the cause. One comes from the workers' cemetery, where skeletal remains reveal chronic malnutrition, physical strain, and weakened immunity shaped by extreme labor conditions. Another comes from the body of diplomatic correspondence produced after year 12, in which references to illness and mortality become increasingly frequent and urgent. A third appears in the royal tomb itself, carved into the cliffs above Amarna, where painted scenes preserve grief with an immediacy that Egyptian royal art rarely allows to surface so openly. Within that tomb appears Akhenaten, the second daughter, shown in a burial chamber prepared for her, where the royal family is depicted standing before her body, and where Nefertiti and Akhenaten are rendered in gestures of mourning that break from the controlled language of royal representation, their bodies bent forward, and their movements expressing a grief that feels deeply human rather than ceremonial, as though something essential has stepped outside the boundaries of ritual form. This moment creates a contradiction within the theology of Amarna itself, because if the Aten is the singular source of life, light, and order, and if the royal family stands in direct communion with that divine force, then the presence of death within that system introduces a rupture that the imagery does not attempt to resolve, leaving instead a silent question embedded in stone. The pattern of loss appears to continue beyond this point, and while the precise sequence and number of deaths remain uncertain, the combined archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the years following year 12 were marked by repeated tragedy within the royal household, until in year 14 of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti disappears from the historical record without explanation. Her disappearance carries no dramatic marker, no recorded death, no official condemnation, and no explanatory inscription, but instead manifests as absence, As her name ceases to appear in dated texts, her image gradually recedes from official representation, and a central figure of Amarna's political and visual world is no longer present within the record that once defined her so completely. Three main explanations attempt to account for this absence, none of which fully resolves the mystery, yet each of which opens a different path into the possible truth. The first possibility is death, likely tied to the same epidemic that moved through the city, and while this would align with the wider pattern of mortality affecting Amarna, the absence of any formal death record remains striking, especially within a culture that typically documented royal transitions with ritual precision, leaving this explanation plausible but incomplete. The second possibility is political displacement, suggesting that Nefertiti may have lost her position within the shifting structure of the Amarna court, as internal dynamics changed and influence moved elsewhere, possibly resulting in her relocation to the northern palace, where archaeological evidence indicates later high-status occupation, although the interpretation of this evidence remains contested among scholars. The third possibility is the most radical, suggesting not disappearance but transformation, because in the period following Akhenaten's death, a ruler named Nefertiti emerges in the historical record, a pharaoh ruling independently and widely believed to have been female. And since this name also forms part of Nefertiti's full titulary, and since the timing aligns precisely with her disappearance, some scholars propose that she may have assumed this identity, taking on full kingship in response to the collapse of the Amarna system. Such a transformation would represent a profound and unprecedented shift, moving from queen to pharaoh, from consort to sovereign, assuming not only political authority, but also the theological identity embedded in kingship itself. And although this cannot be confirmed with certainty, the convergence of evidence leaves the possibility open. Some interpretations extend this hypothesis further, suggesting that the enigmatic figure of Smiting may also be part of this sequence of identities, though this remains speculative and continues to be debated within Egyptology. In the aftermath of the Amarna period, as the traditional religious order was restored under subsequent rulers, a systematic effort began to dismantle the legacy of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, with names erased from monuments, images defaced, and ideological memory actively suppressed, and yet the scale of their presence ensured that complete erasure was never fully possible. As a result, Nefertiti does not conclude within the historical record in any definitive way, but instead vanishes into absence, leaving behind a structural gap in the archive that continues to resist closure. And finally, we get to the last section, the unfinished legacy. In 1912, during excavations at Amarna, a German archaeologist named Ludwig Borchardt uncovered within the workshop of a sculptor one of the most extraordinary artifacts of the ancient world. It was a painted limestone bust of Nefertiti that had survived in remarkable condition for over 3,000 years, preserving both color and form with an almost uncanny clarity. The sculpture presents a face of striking symmetry and composure, with carefully modeled features, a tall blue crown, and an elongated neck that has come to define her image in modern imagination. Yet what immediately distinguishes it is not only its beauty, but its incompleteness, because while one eye is fully formed and inlaid with crystal, the other remains hollow, creating an asymmetry that has generated sustained scholarly debate. One interpretation suggests that the bust functioned as a workshop model, never intended as a finished display piece, but rather as a reference object for artisans, which would explain the absence of a completed second eye. While another interpretation proposes that the missing eye may be the result of deliberate removal, possibly occurring during the political and religious upheavals that followed the abandonment of Amarna, transforming the object into something symbolically altered rather than merely unfinished. After its discovery, the bust was transported to Germany, where it remains in Berlin, exhibited as one of the most visited and recognizable objects from ancient Egypt, its presence in glass-case silence contrasting sharply with the vividness of its preserved paint and form. At the same time, the question of Nefertiti's burial remains unresolved, and in 2015 a theory proposed that her tomb might be concealed behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber in the Valley of the Kings, based on scanned data, suggesting the presence of a sealed space, although subsequent investigations have not confirmed this hypothesis, leaving the question open and unresolved. Despite the application of advanced technologies including radar imaging and non-invasive scanning, no definitive burial site has been identified, and the possibility remains that her tomb still lies hidden within the landscape, preserved by the same desert that once witnessed the rise and collapse of Amarna. What can be stated with certainty is that Nefertiti occupied a central and transformative role within one of the most radical periods of ancient Egyptian history, that she embodied political, religious, and possibly sovereign authority, and that her image and influence were significant enough to resist total erasure even after systematic attempts to remove her from memory. Her name continues to be spoken, and within that repetition lies its enduring meaning. Nefertiti, the beautiful one, has come, a phrase that suggests not conclusion but arrival, not ending but continuation, as though her presence remains suspended between disappearance and return. In that sense, she exists not as a completed figure of history, but as something still unfolding, held between record and silence, between preservation and loss, and it is within that unresolved space that the search for her continues. So let us end then with what we know, what can be said with confidence across all the uncertainty, all the contested theories, and all the deliberate silences of a record that was edited as thoroughly as any in the ancient world. Nefertiti was a mother of 6 daughters, whose grief for a lost child was recorded in a painted tomb, with an emotional honesty that 3,500 years have not diminished. She was a great royal wife, who performed the ritual acts of kingship, with an authority her civilization had spent 15 centuries reserving for men, and she did so not tentatively or symbolically, but completely and repeatedly, in stone and in paint across an entire city, built to receive the sun. She was the feminine principle of a divine triad, worshipped in her own right, in her own temple, by a population that understood the distinction between a queen performing ritual and a goddess accepting devotion. She was possibly a pharaoh, who ruled in her own right, under a name that was hers and was not hers, wearing the mask of kingship over the most famous face in the ancient world, maintaining the dynasty through a period of catastrophic political and theological upheaval with a combination of intelligence and adaptability that the damaged record cannot completely conceal. And she was a woman who loved her daughters with a specificity that the Amarna artists captured, that the desert preserved, and that the German archaeologist Borchardt encountered in a sculptor's workshop in 1912 and struggled to describe. Her name was erased from the walls that bore it. Her face was damaged in the reliefs that showed it. Her tomb, if it was built, if it survives, if the limestone of the Valley of the Kings is still holding it in the patient darkness of its 3,000-year custody, has not been found. And yet, here, in this lamplit room, at this hour, when the long dead feel closer than they do in daylight, her name is being spoken. Nefertiti, the beautiful one, has come. From wherever she came, through whatever transformation she navigated, into whatever darkness finally received her, she is arriving again in the speaking of her name, the way it always promised she would, the way the Ostrakhan artist in the dismantling city refused to let her stop arriving, the way plaster and pigment in a sculptor's workshop preserved her arrival through 33 centuries of desert dark. She is watching us, perhaps, from whatever shadow still holds her, with that composed, slightly interior expression the Amarna artist captured, and that Tutmosis rendered in painted limestone with the care of someone who understood they were working on something that would outlast everything else they would ever make. One eye sees us clearly, one remains in the shadows. The Queen of Shadows, still arriving, still in the process of the coming that her name announces, the beautiful one has come. Rest now. Let the desert hold its silence a little while longer. It has kept this secret for 3,000 years. It can keep it a little longer. And the archive will be here when the morning comes, with more files, more faces drawn on rubble by hands that refuse to forget. Sleep well. The search continues,